The crack of a rifle sent splinters flying just inches from her head. Tessa Caldwell didn't scream. She'd learned long ago that screaming just told them where you were. Instead, she pressed herself so flat against the rough logs of the trapper's cabin that the wood dug into her back, 100 tiny daggers through her thin dress. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat in the sudden, terrible silence. 3 days. She'd been running for 3 days. The Montana wilderness in 1875 was no place for a woman alone, but it was better than the alternative. Better than being sold like a sack of flour to settle a debt. Another shot, this one closer. It ripped through the rotting wood of the cabin wall, and she heard the bullet thud into the dirt floor on the other side. They were toying with her now. Her stepfather, Vernon, and the men he'd brought from the saloon. They knew she was trapped. This cabin, which had looked like salvation an hour ago, was now just a cage. The last light of day was fading, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and purple. Soon it would be dark, and in the dark, they would come for her. The door didn't just open. It was kicked in, slamming against the inside wall with a bang that made her flinch. A silhouette filled the doorway, a large man, broad-shouldered, blotting out the last of the dying light. This was it. This was the end. Tessa squeezed her eyes shut, her hand instinctively going to the small, dull skinning knife she'd found on the floor. It wasn't much, but she wouldn't be taken easily. Heavy boots stepped inside, the jingle of spurs echoing in the small space. A deep voice cut through the gloom. "Anybody in here?" It wasn't Vernon's wheezing rasp. It wasn't one of his hired thugs. This voice was different. Calm. Steady. Tessa held her breath, praying the shadows would swallow her whole. The man took another step, and then another. He was just a few feet away. She could smell the scent of leather and dust, and the cold night air clinging to his coat. A match scraped against stone, and a tiny flame flared to life. In the sudden flickering light, the man's eyes found her. They were a startling, piercing blue. He wasn't one of them. He was a stranger, a cowboy by the looks of him, his face etched with concern, not malice. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, his voice low. He lit a small lantern, and the warm glow pushed back the shadows. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a strong jaw and a few days of stubble. He looked tired, but he also looked capable. He looked dangerous, but not to her. "Stay back," Tessa whispered, her voice raw from fear and disuse. She raised the little knife, her hand trembling. "I have nothing worth taking." The cowboy didn't even glance at the knife. His eyes stayed on hers. "Name's Blake King," he said, his voice even. "I was tracking some strays when I heard shooting. Figured someone was in trouble." The simplicity of it, the straightforward honesty, was so different from the world of lies and threats she'd been living in. But she couldn't afford to trust him. Trust was a luxury she'd lost years ago. "Those shots," she said, her voice shaking, "they were for me." Blake's expression hardened. The easy curiosity was gone, replaced by something flinty and cold. "Who's hunting you?" he asked, the words caught in her throat. "Men who think they own me." A tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She hated herself for that tear. Weakness was a death sentence. Blake took a step closer and she tensed, ready to lunge with the knife. But he stopped. He slowly, deliberately, pulled the leather glove from his right hand. Then he extended his bare hand toward her. "I don't know your story, miss," he said, his blue eyes holding hers. "But no one should be hunted like an animal. If you want help, I'm offering it." Tessa stared at his hand. It was a strong hand, calloused from work, but his gesture was gentle. In her world, no one offered help without a price. Every kindness was a hook, every soft word a lie. But his gaze was unwavering. There was something in his eyes, a deep well of conviction that felt real. Outside, she heard the sound of approaching horses. They were coming. They were almost here. With a shuddering breath, her decision was made. She wasn't choosing to trust him. She was just choosing him over them. Her small, trembling hand reached out and placed itself in his. His grip was firm, warm, and in that moment, as he pulled her to her feet, the world shifted on its axis. "Tessa," she whispered. "My name is Tessa Caldwell." He gave a curt nod. "Miss Caldwell, we need to move, now." Just as he spoke, a voice shouted from outside, Vernon's voice. "She's in there! I saw the light!" Blake didn't hesitate. He snuffed out the lantern with a single puff of breath, plunging them back into darkness. He pulled her toward the back of the cabin. "My horse is tied up behind the trees," he whispered, his voice urgent. "It's a 10-mile ride to my ranch. Can you do it?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He pushed open a small, creaking shutter on the back wall. The opening was barely big enough to squeeze through. He went first, then reached back for her, pulling her out into the cold night air. A magnificent black stallion stood waiting, silent as a shadow. Blake swung himself into the saddle with a fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime on horseback. He reached down, and his strong arm circled her waist, lifting her up behind him as if she weighed nothing at all. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Tessa wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face against the rough fabric of his coat as he spurred the horse into a gallop. They exploded from the cover of the trees just as Vernon and his men rounded the side of the cabin. Shouts of anger and surprise followed them, and then the crack of another rifle shot, the bullet whistling past them in the dark. But the black stallion was impossibly fast, its hooves thundering across the open plain, eating up the distance with every powerful stride. The wind whipped at Tessa's face, cold and sharp, but the heat from Blake's body was a solid, grounding presence. She clung to him, a complete stranger, her only hope in a world that had turned against her. And for the first time in 3 days, she felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten. Hope. After what felt like an eternity, a cluster of lights appeared in the vast darkness ahead. A ranch. Blake slowed the powerful stallion to a walk, the horse barely breathing hard after the desperate run. "Welcome to the Lazy K," he said over his shoulder. "It's not much, but it's home." As they entered the main yard, the door of the largest house swung open. An old man with a face like a weathered map and a rifle held at the ready stepped onto the porch. His eyes narrowed, then relaxed when he saw Blake. "You're back late, boss," the man said. Then his eyes fell on Tessa, and the suspicion returned. "And you've brought company." Blake dismounted and reached up to help her down. Her legs were so shaky she almost collapsed. "This is Tessa Caldwell," Blake said, his hand steadying her. "She's in trouble, Tom. There are men after her." Tom's eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over her. "What kind of trouble?" Before Tessa could answer, Blake spoke for her. "The worst kind." He led her inside, into a room that was warm and clean and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and dark hair braided with silver came from the kitchen. "Maria, this is Miss Caldwell," Blake said. "She'll be staying with us." Maria took one look at Tessa's torn dress and exhausted face, and her expression softened into one of pure, motherly compassion. "Pobrechita," she murmured, taking Tessa's arm. "Come, a hot bath and a warm bed for you." Tessa looked at Blake, a question in her eyes. He just nodded. "You're safe here," he said, and the way he said it with such absolute certainty made her believe it. As Maria led her up a staircase, Tessa glanced back. Blake was standing at the bottom, watching her go, and she realized something strange. He wasn't just a cowboy. The way he moved, the way Tom deferred to him, the almost military-like readiness of the ranch. This place wasn't just a home. It felt like a fort, and Blake King was its commander. The question wasn't just who was hunting her, the real question was who exactly had just saved her. The sun was high in the sky when Tessa awoke. For a dizzying moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed was soft, the blankets clean. A simple but sturdy dress was laid out for her on a chair. The events of the night before came rushing back, a tidal wave of fear and adrenaline. She got dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, drawn by the smell of bacon. She found Blake at the kitchen table, looking over a map. He looked up as she entered, and for a split second, something flickered in his eyes. A mix of relief and something else, something deeper. He stood. "Miss Caldwell, I trust you slept well." "Better than I have in years," she admitted. "Thank you for everything." He just nodded. "Please call me Blake." As Maria set a plate of food in front of her, Tessa watched him. He wasn't just a rancher. The map on the table wasn't of cattle trails. It was a topographical map of the entire territory, marked with small, coded symbols. The way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his voice, it was all wrong for a simple cowboy. After breakfast, he offered to show her around the ranch. The Lazy K wasn't just a ranch, it was a fortress in disguise. The bunkhouse was positioned with a clear line of sight to the main road. The barn, solid and stone-built, could serve as a defensive position. His men, the 5 ranch hands she saw working, moved with a quiet efficiency that felt less like cowboys and more like soldiers. "You run a tight ship, Mr. King," she said, testing the waters. "Blake," he corrected her gently. "Out here you have to be prepared for anything." His eyes scanned the horizon as he spoke, a constant, vigilant watch. "I can't stay here," she said, the words tumbling out. "I'll bring more trouble to you. They won't give up." Blake stopped walking and turned to face her. "Let them come," he said, and his voice was so cold it sent a shiver down her spine. "This is my land. You're under my protection now." "But why?" she insisted, her voice rising. "Why would you risk all of this for a complete stranger?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Because a long time ago," he said finally, his voice low and tight with old pain, "a man like Malcolm Reeves, the man who owns that saloon, took everything from my family. He destroyed my father. I made a promise on my father's grave that I would never stand by and watch men like him ruin innocent lives. Ever." His story was simple, powerful, and explained so much. But as he looked at her, his blue eyes intense and searching, she felt a cold dread creep into her heart. His story felt too perfect, too practiced. It felt like an answer designed to satisfy her questions without revealing the real truth. Before she could press him further, a rider came galloping into the yard, his horse lathered in sweat. It was Tom, the old foreman. "Blake!" he shouted, dismounting before the horse had even stopped. "Riders coming from the east! 4 of them, armed! Vernon Hicks is leading them!" Tessa's blood ran cold. They'd found her. Blake's face became a mask of grim determination. He wasn't surprised. He was expecting them. "Tom, get Miss Caldwell back in the house. Maria knows the protocol." "Protocol? What kind of ranch had a protocol for being attacked?" "What are you going to do?" Tessa asked, her voice trembling. Blake's hand rested on the handle of the pistol strapped to his hip. "I'm going to have a talk with your stepfather," he said, his voice deceptively calm. And as Tom hurried her toward the house, Tessa watched Blake stride to the center of the yard. He didn't look like a rancher preparing to defend his home. He looked like a general taking his position on a battlefield. From the window of the main house, Tessa watched the 4 riders enter the yard. Her stepfather, Vernon, looked smug. Beside him, the saloon owner, Malcolm Reeves, a man with eyes like chips of ice, scanned the ranch with a predatory gaze. The other 2 were hired guns, their faces hard and cruel. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Blake's voice was calm, but it carried across the yard with an authority that made all 4 men rein in their horses. "We're looking for my stepdaughter," Vernon snarled. "We know she's here. A trapper saw you ride off with her. Hand her over and we'll be on our way." Reeves leaned forward in his saddle, a sneer on his thin lips. "That girl is my property, Cowboy. She was sold to me, fair and square, to cover this fool's debts." Blake didn't even flinch. "Funny," he said, his voice dangerously low. "She tells it a little different. And on my land, her story is the only one that matters. I suggest you turn your horses around." One of the hired guns went for his pistol. He never even cleared the holster. "I wouldn't," Blake warned, and his voice was like cracking ice. Suddenly, from the roof of the barn, from the windows of the bunkhouse, the sunlight glinted off the barrels of at least half a dozen rifles. Blake's men. They had appeared from nowhere, silent and deadly, their weapons all trained on the four intruders. Vernon's face went pale. Reeves, however, just looked annoyed. "This isn't over, rancher," Reeves said, his voice a venomous hiss. "You've made a powerful enemy today." "I'm counting on it," Blake replied. As the four men rode away, defeated and humiliated, Blake turned and looked directly at the window where Tessa was standing. His expression wasn't one of relief. It was one of grim satisfaction. He hadn't just protected her. He had sent a message. He had declared war. That night, the tension in the ranch house was thick enough to cut with a knife. The hands ate in shifts, 2 men always on watch. This wasn't a precaution. It was a well-practiced routine. After dinner, Tessa found Blake on the porch, staring out into the star-dusted darkness. "They'll be back," she said, stating the obvious. "Yes," he agreed. "But next time, they'll bring more men." She had to know the truth. "Who are you, Blake? Really? You're no ordinary rancher." He turned to her, his face half hidden in shadow. He was silent for a long moment, and she thought he wouldn't answer. "My father wasn't just a rancher," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "He was a federal judge. And Malcolm Reeves wasn't just a saloon owner. He was part of a criminal syndicate that was trying to steal this entire valley, using gambling debts and intimidation to drive people off their land." The air grew cold. This was bigger, so much bigger, than her own small tragedy. "Reeves had my father murdered," Blake continued, his voice tight with a grief that was still raw. "He made it look like an accident. No one could prove anything. So I left my life behind. I bought this ranch, the old Lazy K, and I started gathering evidence. My ranch hands are men my father trusted, former soldiers, lawmen, men who believe in justice." It was a staggering revelation. The Lazy K wasn't a ranch, it was an undercover command post. Blake King wasn't a cowboy, he was an avenger. "And me?" Tessa asked, her voice trembling. "Where do I fit into all this?" "You, Tessa," he said, turning to face her fully, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath, "are the first witness who has survived long enough to testify against him. Your stepfather wasn't just selling you to settle a debt, he was selling you to Reeves to buy his silence about the entire operation. Reeves wanted you not as property, but as a hostage to ensure Vernon never talked." The world tilted under her feet. Her entire ordeal, the flight through the wilderness, the terror. It was all a symptom of a much larger disease. And now she was standing at its heart. "Reeves won't stop until he has you," Blake said. "Because you're the one person who can bring his entire empire crashing down." A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the porch. Blake moved faster than she could blink. He pushed her down behind a railing, drawing his pistol in a single, fluid motion. "Stay down!" he hissed. The night erupted in a blaze of gunfire. It wasn't just a few men this time. It was an army. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from all sides. They were surrounded. The war Blake had been preparing for had just arrived on his doorstep, and Tessa was standing right in the middle of the killing ground. The siege was relentless. Bullets splintered the wood of the house, shattering windows and chewing up the porch rails. Blake and his men returned fire with disciplined precision, their shots carefully aimed, wasting no ammunition. It was a terrifying, orchestrated dance of death. Maria pulled Tessa away from the front of the house, her face a grim mask of determination. She pushed a heavy shotgun into Tessa's hands. "If they get inside," the older woman said, her voice steely, "you know what to do. Better to die on your feet than live on your knees in Reeves's world." The cold, hard weight of the gun was a terrible reality. These people, strangers just a day ago, were willing to die for her. Or were they? A chilling thought cut through her fear. Were they dying for her, or for the evidence she represented? Was she a person to be protected, or just a key to unlock Blake's revenge? Hours crawled by. The constant roar of gunfire became a numbing backdrop to the chaos. One of Blake's men was hit, a cry of pain quickly stifled. Maria was at his side in an instant, tearing cloth for bandages, her hands steady despite the violence raging outside. They were running low on ammunition. The attackers were getting bolder, using the cover of darkness to creep closer to the house. "They're making a push for the barn!" Tom shouted from a window. "If they take it, they'll have the high ground." Blake's face was grim. "I'll go," he said. "Provide covering fire." Before Tessa could scream a protest, he was gone, slipping out the back door and melting into the shadows. She ran to a rear window, her heart pounding in her throat, and watched as he made a desperate dash across the open ground toward the barn. He almost made it. A sniper, hidden on a nearby ridge, fired. Tessa saw Blake stagger, a dark stain blossoming on his side. He went down. "No!" The scream was ripped from her lungs. For a moment the world stopped. The gunfire, the shouting, it all faded into a dull roar. All she could see was Blake, lying motionless in the dirt. Then something inside her snapped. The fear, the helplessness, it all burned away, replaced by a white-hot rage. These men had taken her home, her freedom, and now they had taken the one person who had shown her any kindness. She looked down at the shotgun in her hands. Maria had told her what to do if they got inside, but she wasn't going to wait. She was going to bring the fight to them. Tessa didn't think. She just acted. While Tom and the others were focused on the main assault, she slipped into the kitchen. She remembered the map she had seen on Blake's table that morning. It wasn't just a map of the territory. It was a detailed schematic of the ranch itself. She had noticed something odd, a small notation by the old root cellar at the back of the property, a symbol that looked like a lightning bolt. Adrenaline surging through her veins, she ran out the back, staying low, using the chaos as cover. The root cellar doors were heavy, but she managed to pry them open. Inside, it smelled of damp earth and potatoes. But against the far wall, hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a small metal door. It wasn't locked. She pulled it open and stared in disbelief. It was a telegraph room, a direct line to the outside world. Blake wasn't just gathering evidence, he was part of a network. Her fingers flew over the key, tapping out a frantic, desperate message, the SOS code she had learned from a book years ago, followed by their location and the words, "Under attack, U.S. Marshal down." She repeated the message over and over, praying someone was listening. Just as she finished her third transmission, she heard footsteps outside the cellar. She grabbed the shotgun, her heart hammering, and flattened herself against the wall as the cellar doors creaked open. One of Reeves's men peered down into the darkness, a pistol in his hand. He took a step down the ladder, then another. Tessa held her breath, waiting for the right moment. When his feet touched the floor, she stepped out from the shadows and pulled both triggers. The shotgun bucked in her hands, the roar deafening in the enclosed space. The man was thrown backward, a stunned look on his face, before he collapsed in a heap. She didn't have time to be sick or scared. She scrambled out of the cellar just in time to see Malcolm Reeves himself leading a final charge toward the house. His men had breached the main porch. Tom and the others were falling back, about to be overrun. But then, from the east, came a new sound, the thundering of dozens of horses and the high, piercing cry of a cavalry bugle. Help had arrived. A troop of U.S. Marshals, led by a grim-faced man with a silver star on his chest, slammed into Reeves's flank, their Colts and Winchesters blazing. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. Caught between the Marshals and the defenders of the ranch, Reeves's men broke and ran. But Reeves wasn't running. He saw Tessa standing by the root cellar, the smoking shotgun in her hands, and his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He knew she was the one who had brought ruin upon him. He raised his pistol, ignoring the Marshals charging toward him, his eyes fixed only on her. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the flash from his barrel, heard the crack of the shot, but she didn't feel any pain. A figure had moved between them. It was Blake. He had dragged himself from the dirt, his face pale, his shirt soaked in blood, and thrown himself in front of her. He took the bullet meant for her, a second impact that spun him around. He crumpled to the ground at her feet. At the same moment, a volley of shots from the Marshals cut Reeves down where he stood. Tessa fell to her knees beside Blake, tears streaming down her face. "Blake, no, please!" she sobbed, pressing her hands to his wounds, trying to stop the bleeding. He looked up at her, his blue eyes clouded with pain, but a small smile touched his lips. "Knew you were trouble," he whispered, his voice a faint rasp. Then his eyes closed. The head marshal, Jack Hollister, knelt beside them. "He's alive," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "King is too stubborn to die, but we need to get him inside now." They carried Blake into the house he had fought so hard to defend. Maria, her face etched with grief but her hands steady as ever, immediately went to work, cutting away his bloody shirt. "One went clean through," she announced. "The other is lodged near his heart. I cannot get it." "Then we'll bring a doctor from Helena," Hollister declared. "Whatever it takes." He turned to Tessa, his gaze filled with a mixture of awe and respect. "The telegraph. That was you?" Tessa could only nod, still in shock. "You saved us all, miss," he said. "Blake was right about you. He said you were a fighter." In the days that followed, the Lazy K was transformed into a field hospital and a federal command post. The truth finally came out. Blake wasn't just a former judge's son. He was Deputy U.S. Marshal Blake King, operating deep undercover for over a year. Tom, Maria, and his hands were all part of his task force. The documents they found in Reeves's office, combined with Tessa's testimony, were enough to dismantle the entire criminal syndicate, a web of corruption that reached all the way to the territorial governor's office. Tessa never left Blake's side. She sat with him while the doctor, brought in by a special train, performed the delicate surgery to remove the bullet. She held his hand through the fever that followed. She read to him, talked to him, willing him to live. On the 5th day, he opened his eyes. His gaze was clear, and when he saw her, his expression softened. "Tessa," he whispered, "you stayed." "Of course I stayed," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I had nowhere else to go." He managed a weak smile. "I was hoping you'd stay even if you did." A few weeks later, when Blake was strong enough to sit on the porch, he officially offered her a permanent home at the Lazy K. "It's not much," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken on that first night. "Just a quiet ranch." Tessa laughed through her tears. "Your idea of a quiet ranch and mine are very different, Marshal King." "Blake," he corrected her. "Just Blake." He took her hand, the same way he had in the cabin, his grip firm and steady. "I know this isn't the life you planned, but if you'll have me, Tessa Caldwell, I'd be honored to share it with you." He wasn't just offering her safety, he was offering her a home, a partnership, a future. "I'm not the same woman you found in that cabin," she said softly. "I know," he replied, his blue eyes full of love and admiration. "You're so much more." She looked out over the valley, peaceful now, the scars of the battle already beginning to fade. She had been running from a life that someone else had tried to choose for her. And she had run straight into a life she could choose for herself. "Yes, Blake," she said, her heart full. Yes. Their wedding was a simple affair, held right there in the yard of the Lazy K, with Marshall Hollister officiating and Tom giving the bride away. The entire valley, the people whose homes and lands they had saved, came to celebrate. As Blake slipped a simple gold band on her finger, he leaned in and whispered, "From the moment I saw you, I knew my life would never be the same." Tessa smiled up at him, her own life irrevocably changed. "You reached for my hand," she whispered back, "and you never let it go." He held her hand tighter. "And I never will." Their life together was built on the foundation of that promise. They rebuilt the Lazy K, not as a fortress, but as a true home, a beacon of hope and justice in the newly formed state of Montana. Blake eventually became the state's head U.S. Marshal, but he always came home to the ranch, to the valley he had fought for, and to the woman who had saved him as much as he had saved her. They had children and then grandchildren, and their story became a local legend. The story of the Marshal and the runaway, the two souls who found each other in the dark and brought the light. It was a story about how sometimes the greatest courage isn't in fighting or running, but in the simple act of taking someone's outstretched hand. If you enjoyed this story of courage and justice on the frontier, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history.